Hello and welcome to another weekly episode of Bingley Talks Politics. We have a slightly different makeup to the team today. Mr. Cook is absent this afternoon, but I have my usual sixth form political aficionado, Finn. Hello, Finn.
Hello.
And we have, I am very pleased to say, both Eva and Isla from Year 10 back with us. Hello.
Hi. Hi.
You were here a few weeks ago, weren't you, on making your debut on Bingley Talks Politics, which is a very important moment in people's lives, a seminal moment in their lives. You've got over that, so you're back again, and we're going to do a slightly different topic. Well, we're doing a different topic, but it's an extension of what we discussed last week, isn't it, Finn? And we're going to go around the houses on protest. We thought about a few questions that we could look at on protest. There's loads to say on protest, but overall we're going to sort of think, is it justified? Does it work? But let's just take a step back, people. Why do people protest? I mean, my first answer, then I want to throw it open to you guys, is to say it's one way of taking part in the democracy. You get to vote every so often in a general election, once every usually 5 years, maybe a bit less. You get to vote in council elections, other elections, but that's just voting, and there are other things to do. So people want to take part in a democracy. So we should look at it like that. That sounds like a positive way to see it. Finn, what do you think? Why are people protesting? Whether that's now, then, whether that's the same reasons. What do you think?
Well, for many people, I mean, like us, you know, we can't vote. We're all under 18. It's almost like a good way of voting with your feet, in effect. You know, going out into the streets and saying what you want.
Active citizenship.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. And so, you know, whilst it might not be directly influencing power, I think it does have quite a lot of role. It's about being part of a movement, isn't it? Feeling like you are doing something. You are trying to physically, although it might not immediately have the results. Protests are normally a cumulative thing to try and build that change, and going out there physically to do that, it's quite symbolic.
It gives people a sense of participation, and it means quite a lot to them on a range of issues. Isla, what do you think? Why would you say? What's the most important reason why someone might protest? What do you think?
To catalyse that political change and put through their beliefs and feel like they are being heard.
Yeah, a couple of really good points there. Can I just focus on change? I mean, most people protest to change something, right? And we can think of many examples we might have studied in school. Does protest actually often result in change? Can we think of examples where there is a lot of change? Or if it doesn't, does that matter? Eva, what do you think to protest and change? What do you think's happening?
Protest and change should go hand in hand. You don't protest something you're happy with. You protest something you want to change. So, for example, the suffrage movement in the 1900s protested until they got the result they wanted.
But it took them a long time, didn't it? It took a long time for that to happen, and you can put that part of a wider movement to try and change the status and position of women. I mean, that's a good example in the sense that some of the key things they wanted did happen, and you can debate as to how much it was that we call them the suffragettes, the suffragists, and all those groups who contributed to that. But what if that doesn't happen, or it takes ages? Is it still important to protest?
I think that it might not create that change in the government straight away, but it does give the public an idea that people are wanting that change and they aren't happy with it, and that might eventually cause pressure on the government. But I feel that there's also it brings awareness.
Yeah, that was a point I was picking up on then. Actually, it raises awareness across the public sometimes, and that's a good thing as well. There might not be a particular issue. We talked about the recent there's quite a lot of environmental protests over the last 2 or 3 years. What about those now? Are they working? And what do we think about the reaction to them, Finn?
Yeah, I mean, they're very interesting, actually, and it's interesting when you kind of get into the arguments of whether or not they are effective. Obviously, the climate protest, it's gone from a few years ago. We had Fridays for Future, quite peaceful, quite restrained, but it was forceful in what they were saying. You know, I mean, I was part of Fridays for Future, and it's turned into something a bit more. You know, I mean, I think the situation is desperate, but it has turned into something much more physical. Now, my personal view on the Just Stop Oil protests, which is, you know, throwing soup all over the Van Gogh painting. My personal view is that I think that I saw the woman who did it. I don't know if you saw. She did an amazing explanation for it and backed it up very well. All over Twitter, it got something like 300,000 likes, and she was very well reasoned, very well backed up. However, I was listening to Radio 4, I was listening to the news, and I was reading the news, and all of the discussion was about why we should be clamping down on protests, and is protests justified? Now, the problem with that is that she was originally intending that protest to be a spark to talk more about climate change, and the conversation was just shifted onto protest. And in fact, Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, she has used many of these climate protests as justification to clamp down more with the with some of her protest bills that she's trying to get through.
Yeah, Eva, what do you think to the climate protests recently, or issues of recent years?
I think that the recent climate protests where the young woman threw the soup on the painting, I think it was really quickly villainised by the media of this is destroying things, there's no point to this, but really it did exactly what it was intended to do. It brought attention to climate change, and although the discussions that were had around it were not exactly what she intended, it still brought light, and a lot more people will now be more informed about climate change because she made a statement.
Yeah, so two things to pick up on that. If it takes one is the reaction to protesters. Why are they criminalised sometimes, portrayed as villains? You were suggesting. Why is there such a negative reaction, do we think, by some, the media and government maybe, and why?
I think because, especially with the soup protest, I think my first initial reaction when I saw it, before I saw a very well-reasoned explanation, my first initial reaction was that this looks bad, and this looks silly. And it did look silly, and she had a good point behind that. Many people will villainise them almost because they are mainly young people.
So there's a bit of a generational thing going on.
Yeah, and I think it kind of plays into the hands of, we've seen a lot recently about this kind of the wokes, liberal snowflakes, and this kind of suits that untrue.
So identity politics, the culture wars a little bit, you know, that division between generations and groups, that plays on into it. I mean, it's quite interesting as well, and I think probably all through history protesters have been demonised or criminalised. I mean, it's not something new, and it's not the case in all protests, because there's been tons, and some of them you might suggest are not particularly for valid reasons. But let's just have two or three here. Okay, I think the debate has got less because I think the evidence has got stronger. But wouldn't you have to be an idiot to say that climate change isn't something quite urgent?
Yeah.
Right? So things have been done, but then the general consensus is too slowly and more needs to be done, because otherwise we can see problems. We actually see them, don't we, now as well? We get to experience these problems more. Okay, so there's that problem. Then we talk about, say, for example, giving equality and civil rights. So maybe that most people would agree that, you know, how could you not have equality based on, you know, how could there be rules based on skin colour or background of person, right? So for a long time, for example, USA had, it was clear, wasn't it, segregation and civil rights. It wasn't until the 1960s they started to bring laws in about that. So those examples, the end of communism. Communism was a repressive system. Okay, some people might say some of the ideas behind it were good, whatever, but really it turned into dictatorship. It was a repressive system. And protest, people power, was a very important way in actually bringing communism to an end. Not the only way, but an important way. So it's quite interesting that protest, and protesting the civil rights, protesting communism, maybe protest now, because it seems to be the main thing to keep climate change in the news and moving forward. They're championing causes that are like really important, but yet progress just seems to be slow and we seem to have these bad reactions. Isn't that a little bit odd?
Yeah, I think people are definitely in denial because everyone has a very set way of living, for example, using petrol in their cars, and so when people are all of a sudden told to change their way of life and to change things, people very quickly get very defensive. Well, it's not me, I'm not going to make a difference. And there's a big debate around veganism not making a difference, but also, like, I think, I can't remember the statistic, but it must have been like the top 2% of companies in the world produce 99% of the pollution. But even the smallest things can make a difference, but I don't think people realise that.
I mean, I'm just trying to think in the last sort of 5-10 years that I think people have started to make small changes, whether that's the bags they use to go shopping with plastic reduction, being aware of not like taking a shower for as long and using, and obviously with the cost of living crisis and the fossil, and the link to fossil fuels and the war in Ukraine, everyone's sort of thinking about saving. Everyone's piling on more jumpers at night rather than putting the heating on or whatever. Yeah, you probably recognise that a little bit. But it just still strikes me as something that's quite odd, and so that people don't recognise perhaps the need for change. How then would you change people's minds? That's a great question, isn't it? Whether it's a protester, how do you get people who don't recognise that, and climate change would be a good example, how would you sort of get them to change? I suppose that's similar to a question, what are the best ways to protest, but it's not exactly the same thing.
Do you think potentially, I suppose one of the successful things about how civil rights protests, and I think this is a really good example because civil rights was about getting something done. It was about passing legislation, making equality similar to what we're facing now. I think one of the ways that Martin Luther King did it was he worked with the existing power structures that were already there. Now, obviously, you could say, I think you mentioned it about the media's villainising, and that is true to an extent. I think the media has acted in a negative way, perhaps unjustly, towards the climate protesters. But I think there sort of needs to be a recognition that you can't have this outsider protest like Just Stop Oil working against power without also having somebody on the inside who's working.
They often use the outsider-insider distinction, don't they? An outsider group would be one that's seen as a bit more radical, would do the more radical extreme, perhaps you would describe it as, things, and that would alienate them, possibly, but would get media attention. Should they, and what should or shouldn't they do? Are they okay to lie in front of traffic and stop people, Isla? What do you think? Is that fair?
I mean, there are lots of debates about whether, for suffragettes, as an example, there's lots of debates about whether violent protest hinders the work of the peaceful protesters, or whether it furthers it, and I think that's important.
Yeah, I mean, what do you think though? Does violence work?
I think there's a point where if you've been peacefully protesting for a long time, such as years, and you're not being heard, and the media's not listening, and the government isn't listening, there's an element of not necessarily violence, but more radical action.
Militant, radical, yeah.
Your responsibility, because if you care about a cause, then surely you would go to certain extents. Now, I'm not saying violence against people or animals, but I think that there's a certain extent where you have to do something about it. If you care, then it's your responsibility.
It's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, I suppose violence isn't necessarily the best word, is it? There are other ways to describe that. But I suppose that's what some environmentalists would use. No one's really listening. Change isn't coming quick enough. We need to get our point over stronger. I mean, it's not quite the same thing, but one of the most famous figures of the 20th century, Nelson Mandela, was actually, well, he committed acts of violence, not necessarily, and would be willing to go to that extent, yet is regarded as obviously one of a great change maker and figure. So it does often go. It's quite close together. Martin Luther King, on the other hand, is famously remembered for not passive resistance and not being violent and renouncing all that side of things. What can climate change activists do then in the next 3 years to make their cause, to get more progress on their cause? What could they do?
I think there needs to be. I mean, I've been involved in. Obviously, send my friends to school. I think you're involved in it now. Go to COP26, stuff like that. I sort of recognise that we need to work more, and we need to win change through the ballot box and make it known. Obviously, in Australia, there was an election recently in about May this year, and it was said that one of the big reasons that Labour won there was because of the teal vote, and that was conservative, quite liberal conservative voters who were interested in green policies and didn't necessarily associate with the existing conservative parties there. They held those green policies quite importantly. Now, I think the debate over whether or not climate change is happening, that's long gone. We're talking now about what we need to do to sort things out. How do we approach the problem? I think especially with protests, we need to consistently evaluate, how effectively has that actually worked in trying to help the cause. And I think it's also important to distinguish that no one protest is going to change the world. It's a cumulative thing.
Yeah, I suppose going back to what you were suggesting, a massive thing would be to get a political party to say, right, we're going to do this, something big on the environment. Do you think they'll do that? So by a mainstream party in this country, we're really talking about Conservatives or Labour. Will either of them in the next election come out with a big green agenda?
I think it's a possibility, but I think that popularity is important because obviously you need to win the election to be able to get your policies through. And
that goes back to the generational thing a little bit, doesn't it? We were talking about with the old generations a bit more sceptical.
And I think, older generations are more sceptical, and older generations are more set in their ways. For example, they might have always voted Conservative or always voted Labour, and so if one or the other that doesn't necessarily align with them comes out with a new policy, they don't necessarily see the urgency to vote for the green policies. They might just think, well, it's not my problem. It'll be their world, not mine. Let them sort it.
And it clashes also against immediate problems such as trying to save money when the cost of living's going up. And some people see the green agenda as expensive, and in some ways it is, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I think, increasingly, one of the important things to point out is that it's seen as an economic benefit. Like, I think learning history, you might be learning history now, about the New Deal in Frank FDR. And one of the things that I'm a big advocate of, what I really believe in, is this Green New Deal. Labour is selling that. Labour has got quite a big package for that. Whether or not it's all that it's promised to be.
I mean, long term, it probably would have significant economic benefits, but it's that can you convince people to go long term, convince that they're going to actually... How far in the future do people think?
I think that for an election basis, people are looking more in the short term.
They are, yeah, probably.
They're going to be thinking, how does that benefit me now for what I'm voting for? And I think going back to this point about it's about popularity, I feel that protest can show parties that a lot of people in areas there, they want that, and that then may make the party think I can get a lot of votes if I add in green policies.
There was some really interesting research. Two protests we've not mentioned. Anti-lockdown remember COVID? Remember that? Yeah, there was a thing called COVID, wasn't there? And then there was a thing called lockdowns, and some people went on anti-lockdown protests. I was a bit sceptical of people who did that, because I think maybe I sort of naively thought they might be into sort of conspiracy theorist type people. But there was interesting research went on in America on those people and the one who went around about the same time to Black Lives Matter, the George Floyd and then the explosion of sort of protests in the UK as well. And there was the toppling of the Edward Colston statue, if you remember that, in Bristol and all of that. And actually what this research suggested is don't think that these protesters are necessarily on the fringes of society, radicals, unusuals, misfits, all of that, people who they only... Actually, when you look at the groups, in both groups, and there was actually an overlap, people who went on both, you shouldn't judge a book by its cover. There's a bit more depth to it. They're quite broadly reflective of society, which I thought was a really interesting point. And then the research painted actually the government out, who aren't doing anything, as the more extremists. You're the ones out of step. Because perhaps it will only take a government to be bold, and then, because perhaps if someone sort of said, look, we're going to do this because it needs this doing for our, children, grandchildren, or however they frame it, actually people might go, yeah, okay, that sounds a good idea. But we don't seem to have politicians willing to take that. I don't hear that as in this country as really loud. Keir Starmer's mentioned it, but he's probably a bit nervous about how much you should devote to it in case it's not popular in the election, as you said. But it's interesting. I think wonder if people would quite easily shift and say, yeah, that's a good idea, we should do it and support it. I'll give you an example, though, in a car park recently, a real-life example. This is exciting, you'll like this. So I was waiting to pick my daughter up from her netball practice, right? Don't worry, it's about the environment, this. And like a good boy, I turned my engine off, right? I turned my engine off and was just waiting there, meditating or whatever I was doing, thinking, okay, take advantage of this 2 minutes of silence in my life before it's disrupted. However, it was disrupted by the car next to me being approached by someone I knew, actually, a parent of another child playing. And he's knocking on the window, and that's nothing to do with me. But I could sense the whole thing was getting a little bit agitated, it's not usual. So I thought, well, early Friday night entertainment, let's wind the window down. What are they talking about? Right? And is he going to knock on my window next? Right? And so I was getting a bit like, oh, what's all this about? Because then he went over to somebody else, knocked on their window. Clearly didn't look like it was going to be a sort of normal conversation, like, hello, I've not seen you for a while, that kind of thing. Transpired, can you please turn your engine off? These two cars had their engine on. He didn't call on me because I said I was very good and turned mine off. But I was listening in by that point, trying to think, oh, okay, this is interesting. And they wouldn't do it. They wouldn't turn the engine off. So that then got into a discussion. You might even say argument about, well, why won't you? And then the guy who was trying to convince them was sounded like a good point, about pollution particles or whatever it was, and he was going on about this, and he wouldn't win them over. So I thought, well, that's interesting psychologically. Is it because we don't like anyone telling us what to do? Yeah, Eva's nodding at this point. You think that's... And does that become a problem with the environment, and people are told that they should stop doing this and they're bad people if they do it?
Yeah, I think people are very stubborn and set in their ways, particularly older generations, and they don't necessarily want change, or they don't think that it'll affect them. And I think that there needs to be some sort of drastic figures to come out and be put on mainstream media, and for people to see the
horror of it almost, yeah.
Already affecting other people in different parts of the world, like flooding of schools, that are affecting others and not just them, so that then people.
So I don't think we really got as much. I'm going to go back to the netball court in a minute, by the way. So I know everybody's. I know all our millions of listeners are waiting for this. But we didn't. I mean, I think we probably all know. I think many people know. But there wasn't. Was there a huge amount about the extensive flooding in Pakistan in the news?
I mean, to say,
But it's absolutely terrible when you look at the just basic statistics of how much of the country was flooded. A big country, which was just really badly affected either.
I think there's a sense of, well, it's not affecting me.
Yeah,
why do I need to change?
it's a foreign country. Yeah, I think you're probably
And
right.
I think, yeah.
Well, on that change then, my other interpretation of Netball Gate and its environmental policy is, or could it be that in the moment people are saying, no, I'm not having you tell me what to do.
Yeah.
That's quite a British thing maybe. So, no one can tell me what to do. However, the next week would they turn their engine off? Would they sort of say? Would they acknowledge to say, yeah, perhaps he had a point, and perhaps I should just do that. So that's that small thing. People just those small actions. Whilst they might not have a huge impact, and it might need other things to happen, does contribute, doesn't it? And it gets also a little bit of recognition. So I don't know. I haven't tested it. I need to go back and do conduct a survey, see what happens. But I might just look a bit odd doing that. So I haven't done that yet. But I thought that was an interesting one on individual action, because protests have a number of different impacts, whether they get the law to change or not. Now, as we move into the last part of our podcast, are you aware of the new? I don't know if it's actually been made law. You might know, Finn. The bill that's gone through Parliament about the police and protest bill.
Police and crime bill.
Police and crime bill, yeah. But it's got a protest in large. Are we aware of this?
Yeah. I think protest is a very important part of democracy. Like, if you look back on past protests, if protest was a lot more restricted, then things like the suffrage movement would have been a lot harder to achieve.
So do you know what they're going to?
We can all agree that that's benefited our society.
Yeah.
And
as I say, these big things that we all now look back on and say, why didn't we even?
Yeah.
Why did it take so long? I mean, it's not even 100 years since women have had the vote on the same basis as men. I mean, that every time I teach, it's just crazy, isn't it? That is crazy, but that's the way it was, or way it has been. Yeah. So I mean, how? Again, it's back to that sort of that change that protest can achieve. But is it? Do you know what the government's going to do then for people who are going on protests now? Finn, are you aware of what they're able to collect?
I'm not quite sure, but don't the police get? Well, they kind of get almost unrestricted powers, don't they?
Yeah. Huge increase in police powers, access to people who've been on protests, knowledge of them. Eva, what do you think to that?
I think once you start criminalising protest and start allowing police to use more militant action against protesters, then society moves more towards a dictatorship, because although we're still allowed to vote for whatever party we want, we all know that really it's between Labour or Conservatives. That again narrows down our choices. And then once you're then no longer allowed to protest, what can you do? Nothing really, because
that's a great point.
It links into freedom of speech as well.
So it's closing down those opportunities potentially. Isla, do you like this? Can you see any positives in that, or this? Not really, no. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know all the ins and outs, and I'm sure people would give a slightly different justification, but it does mean more knowledge of, more information on people who have been on protests, big police, increasing police powers to crack down and deal with those protests, and therefore, as you say, Eva, maybe closing down of that. We'll just have to see in the future how they use the powers and whether that is a big impact on future protests. Right, any final points on protest, people? Any protest? Do we think that what is the next thing to protest about?
Cost of living crisis.
Yeah. Okay. What about, just as we finish? What about, should nurses go on strike?
I think in an ideal world, nurses could go on strike, but in reality, then the NHS would collapse.
Railway workers, they're going on strike. Is that okay?
Yeah. I mean, the problem is with the government ultimately, because the government's not been giving them pay rises for 12 years. So we cannot blame. I mean, the government might not have any money, but ultimately, it's their fault for not fixing the roof while the sun was shining.
Nice, yes. These issues are going to be in the news over the next 6 weeks, months, however long it lasts. Really, lots of strikes, lots of unhappiness about the cost of living and what people are going to do with it. And I'd be interested in what happens as a result of it, the media portrayal of it, because again, there's issues there, and we will see how that unfolds. Thank you, everyone. That was a really good discussion on protests. So, any ideas on protests that you've got, please send them in to us. And until next time, goodbye.
Bye.